Hello and welcome to today's Astranti Training Bite-Size video. And as you can see, today's topic is scenario analysis. It's going to be very useful for you if you're studying at the strategic levels such as E3 and P3. But in fact, scenario analysis also creeps up at the management level in E2. So a really worthwhile video to watch for lots of you SEMA students. And today's scenario analysis is an extract from one of our tuition videos. It's taken from the E3 video, in fact, called Scenario Analysis. So basically what we're going to be looking at is, what is scenario analysis? How do you use scenario analysis? And why may businesses ask, what if? In other chapters in this video and in our study text, we've examined the idea of external analysis by using Pestel and Porter's 5 forces, and I'm sure these are topics you will have encountered in other elements of your SEMA qualifications. But if you're a bit rusty on them, I would advise looking at the chapter on the external environment and external analysis before we move on to this section, because we will be using Pestel, we will be using 5 forces, not to look at the current position, which we did do in the external environment and external analysis video, but to look at it in the future. What's going to happen in the future of the organization's environment? Because scenario analysis is the examination of different possible scenarios which may unfold in the future. And that's because things like the Pestel factors and the 5 forces are always going to be changing, are always going to be evolving. So we're going to be looking at factors like this. Obviously, the economy is one element of Pestel analysis, and the economy might be buoyant at the moment in the current position of the organization. But what happens if, in the future, a recession happens? What would happen if a new competitor entered the market? Would the organization be able to cope with this threat? Or perhaps a major competitor might leave the market, which would mean there would be an increase of demand for the organization's products or services. Would they be able to cope with that? Perhaps a competitor may develop a new product which is cheaper than the current products available. What would the organization do to combat that situation? What would the organization do if a major supplier went into liquidation? Would they be able to find a replacement? What we are asking is, what would happen if? And as you can see, there are all fairly major examples, big things that are happening. And we use scenario planning to help us define a strategy. Because if we're taking into account things that could happen in the future, we can build in ways to defend our situation or take advantage of opportunities within the strategy. And then also, by using scenario planning, the organization will be prepared to take appropriate action. So scenario analysis, what if? What could happen if? How would changes in external environment in the future affect the organization? That is the theory behind scenario planning. So, sounds simple in theory, but how does an organization even go about asking what is going to happen? How does an organization know? Well, luckily for you, this is what we're about to state in this video. We're going to give you a 6-step process to scenario planning. And while we do so, I'm going to give you a hypothetical example just to show you how that might work in the real world. And you can see we've got a shopping basket full of food. And that's because a hypothetical example is a Hungarian food retailer. Now, don't worry if you don't know where Hungary is. I've made that up as well. Your geography isn't really poor. And we're going to call this company Big Value Company. And they're thinking about opening in a new territory, Chihuahua. And to do so, they're going to use a local joint venture partner called Good Price. And they are going to own 49% of the joint venture company. Now, we've got our example. And we know we've got a 6-step process. So what is the first step? Well, that is identify the drivers for change. And here's where we use our trusty old friends Pestel and Porter's 5 forces. So this is why I suggested you check out the external analysis video first if you're a bit rusty on them. Because what using Pestel and Porter's 5 forces will do is it will help the organization identify the most important factors that are going to mold and shape the organization's future environment. And these factors that are going to change the environment, that are going to shape the environment in which the organization is going to have to operate, are called the drivers for change. So, for example, let's imagine we're carrying out a Porter's 5 forces analysis, and we realize the barriers to entry to the market are very low. Well, that means it's more than likely that new competitors are going to be entering the market. Barriers are low, competitors enter the market. And that would be one driver for change, because the fact there's going to be lots of new competitors is going to change the environment in the future for the organization itself. So, what does that mean for our Hungarian food retailer as it moves into Chiway? Well, they too, just like we would do, have carried out a Pestel analysis. So let's run through quickly what might be in their Pestel analysis. Well, firstly, remember they're moving territories, and in the new territory they may be allowed to be open, but because they're a foreign company they might be punished for success through higher taxation, or perhaps they may face restrictions on supply of their goods. When we turn to the economic part of Pestel, Big Value noticed that the currency for Chiway is devalued, taxes are raised, and import tariffs are raised. The social factors show us that the local tastes and customs won't welcome Hungarian products. When they look at technological factors, Big Value Chain notice that there could be blocks on using back office and supply chain systems and software that isn't developed inside Chiway. Environmentally, Chiway may suddenly adopt new environmental regulations, and that might mean that Big Value might not be able to get the permission to build where they most need to and want to. With regards to the L in Pestel, the legal factors, the joint venture partner may use access to Big Value's intellectual property or commercial data to compete. And also in Chiway, laws regarding food safety or allowed ingredients in Big Value's products may change suddenly, and if that's not abided by, they may face stiff penalties. So we can see there's a whole host of factors that may affect Big Value as they enter the new market. What's been identified are the most important factors that are going to shape this future environment for Big Value. Now we move on to the second step of our 6 steps of scenario planning, which is bringing the drivers together. So, we've done our first stage, we've carried out some analysis, and we have got a group of different but all important independent drivers. So in this stage, the organization must cluster these drivers together, because otherwise you've just got too many factors. This makes it far more manageable for the organizations to plan for by grouping them together. Now, one way to cluster them together is to do it by making sure the factors are clearly related. So, for example, a new technological development may lead to market changes, but the use of the technology might be regulated by legislative factors. So those two different factors can be clustered together. So how is this going to affect Big Value? Well, we saw that one scenario, the environmental factor, might mean that Big Value can't get the planning permission to build where they want to be. But also, another factor that could be clustered with it is the new site where they would be allowed to build might need a lot more investment than they initially planned, because they've got to build a whole new infrastructure. That would be one scenario. Another scenario may be that the joint venture partner competes against the joint venture and at the same time the local government would block the action against them, and they might give the joint venture partner preferential tax status. That would be one cluster because they are all clearly linked. That would be through the actions of the joint venture. Now, that's a difficult cluster for Big Value to plan for, but imagine if that cluster of factors actually did happen. It would be vital that an organization was ready and had a plan for it. Now, normally, in a real scenario planning exercise, we would have about 7 to 9 groups of these clusters. Any more, and again, there's just too much to plan for. But because it's an example, I'm just going to take that really unhappy cluster and we'll use that going forward. As we enter the halfway point, our third step on the scenario planning process, which is produce initial mini scenarios. So I've already said we're going to have it. Normally, if this wasn't an example, we'd have about 7 to 9 groups or 7 to 9 clusters of scenarios. So now what the organization can do is to evaluate these factors in these clusters and ask, what is the connection? What links them? What do these factors represent? So we're looking at these mini scenarios. And then we turn back to our example. Now, for Big Value, we've noticed we've got an unhappy cluster, the fact that joint venture is acting against them and the local legislation won't allow Big Value to act against the joint venture. Well, then they've got a really difficult contingency to plan for. So what would they do? Well, it's difficult to see beyond any other option apart from Big Value to abandon, to leave the market. But what scenario planning would allow for, by imagining this what-if scenario, they could build this exit strategy into their contracts from the outset because they could be aware that this always might be a possibility. Okay, so there we go. We've got our first 3 steps. Let's move on to number 4, which is reduce to 2 or 3 scenarios. So we've had our 7 to 9, we've planned for them, and now we begin to reduce because these should be the 2 or 3 most important scenarios. And here the detailed analysis can begin. And each one could be labeled optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely to happen. So what does this mean for Big Value? Well, how would you label the cluster that we've looked at, that one scenario? Well, that would be the pessimistic scenario, wouldn't it? It's certainly not going to be optimistic that your joint venture partner acts against you and that you can't take any action against them. So this would be a pessimistic scenario. Okay, let's move on to number 5, which is write the scenarios. And this is really simply what it says. The analysis should be written up in the most suitable form for the people that need to read them, that need to understand them, perhaps for the managers. So for Big Value, for example, they might write the cluster up in an essay and include numeric data and diagrams to make sure that the point is understood. And then we move on to our final step of scenario planning, which is to identify any issues that are arising. What the organization will be looking for here is to examine the scenarios to determine any critical outcomes. Which scenarios have the biggest impact on the organization's future? And then a scenario can be built into the strategy to help them deal with this most critical outcome. So, for Big Value, what does that mean? Well, it means they need to keep an eye on the ground for any developments in Chiwei, and it may be a good idea, if we're thinking about that pessimistic scenario that we have been, to form a relationship with an expert market analyst of Chiwei to be able to feed them data and projections which would allow Big Value to anticipate any changes such as the new laws before they actually happen. So can we see this what if, this planning for these eventualities, these important factors that have come to light through external analysis, they are planned for from the beginning. Now, hopefully using Big Value's example, it's easy for you to see how important this would be for organizations. Its aim is to foresee as many future scenarios as possible rather than just react to them. An organization should have a plan to deal with them from the beginning. Now, there we go. There's our 6 steps. And that's everything that you're going to need to know about scenario planning for your strategic level exams, or perhaps if you're doing your E2, everything you need to know about scenario planning for E2. Now, perhaps that all makes sense and you think, okay, I really understand scenario planning now. Why don't you prove that to yourself by taking out one of our exam practice kits or our mock exam kits and seeing how well you do on the scenario analysis section, the scenario planning questions? Or perhaps you just want to have a look at this full video. You may have seen the real options title on screen, for example, and you think, hey, I want to know about real options. Well, please do that. And if you don't want to do any of that, and in fact you just want to keep on watching these bite-sized videos, that's also great with us. All you have to do is please like this video and subscribe to our channel. And that's everything from me today. Good luck with your exams.